Sarah Martinez wiped down the last table at Murphy's Diner as the clock struck 11. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the empty restaurant. Her uniform hung loose on her small frame, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. To anyone watching, she looked like just another tired waitress finishing another long shift. "You missed a spot," sneered Brad, the night manager, pointing to a barely visible watermark on the counter. At 25, Brad thought he owned the world because his uncle owned the diner. His belly hung over his belt, and his receding hairline made him look older than his years. "Honestly, Sarah, sometimes I wonder why we keep you around." Sarah said nothing. She simply walked over and cleaned the spot again, her movements calm and precise. The other employees had gone home hours ago, leaving just the two of them to close up. "You know what your problem is?" Brad continued, leaning against the register. "You're useless. No personality, no conversation skills, no nothing. Customers barely notice you exist. If it wasn't for the fact that you work for almost nothing, you'd be gone." Sarah finished cleaning and hung up her apron. She had heard this speech many times before. In the 6 months she had worked at Murphy's Diner, Brad had never missed an opportunity to remind her how worthless he thought she was. "Same time tomorrow," she said quietly, grabbing her jacket from the back room. "If you're lucky," Brad called after her. "Business has been slow. Might have to make some cuts soon." The night air was crisp as Sarah walked to her beat-up Honda Civic. The parking lot was empty, except for Brad's flashy red sports car and her own vehicle, which had seen better days 20 years ago. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, looking back at the diner through her rearview mirror. Brad didn't know anything about her. None of them did. 3 weeks later, Sarah was wiping down tables during the lunch rush when she overheard a conversation that made her pause. 2 men in expensive suits were sitting in the corner booth, speaking in low voices. "The shipment comes in tomorrow night," the first man said. He was tall and thin, with slicked-back hair and cold blue eyes. "Pier 17. 2 million worth of product." "What about security?" asked the second man, shorter and stockier, with a scar running down his left cheek. "Bought and paid for. The dock workers have been told to look the other way. Should be smooth sailing." Sarah continued wiping the same table, moving slowly to catch every word. Her training had taught her to listen without appearing to listen, to blend into the background until she became invisible. "After this shipment, we'll have enough to expand operations into the next state," the tall man continued. "Boss will be pleased." "And if anyone gets curious?" the scarred man asked. "They won't. And if they do, well, we know how to handle problems." Both men laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Sarah had heard that kind of laughter before, in places far from this small American town. It was the laughter of men who had done terrible things and would do them again. The men finished their coffee and left, dropping a $5 bill on a $15 tab. Sarah waited until their black sedan pulled out of the parking lot before she moved to clear their table. Under the scarred man's coffee cup, she found a small piece of paper with an address written on it. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street. The place was sparse but clean, with just the basics: a bed, a small kitchen table, 1 chair, and a television she rarely watched. On the surface, it looked like the home of someone who had given up on life, but appearances could be deceiving. Sarah opened the floorboard under her bed and pulled out a metal box. Inside were items that would have surprised anyone who knew her as the quiet waitress from Murphy's Diner. A satellite phone, several fake passports, a substantial amount of cash in different currencies, and at the bottom, wrapped in black cloth, a small silver pin in the shape of a trident. The Navy SEAL pin she had earned 8 years ago, after becoming one of the first women to complete the grueling training program. The pin she had stopped wearing the day she decided to disappear from her old life. Sarah Martinez wasn't her real name. Her real name was Commander Elena Rodriguez, and until 2 years ago, she had been one of the most decorated special operations officers in the United States Navy. She had led missions in countries whose names never appeared in newspapers. saved hostages whose faces never appeared on television, and eliminated threats that the public would never know existed. She had also witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see: a high-ranking official selling weapons to enemies of the state. When she tried to report it through proper channels, she discovered the corruption went higher than she had imagined. People she trusted tried to silence her permanently. So Elena Rodriguez had died in a car accident on a lonely mountain road, and Sarah Martinez had been born in a small town 3 states away. She had spent 2 years perfecting the role of an invisible woman, someone so unremarkable that no one would ever suspect her true identity. But old habits died hard. Even in retirement, she couldn't stop watching, couldn't stop listening, couldn't stop caring when innocent people were in danger. The conversation she had overheard at the diner troubled her. $2 million worth of product could only mean one thing: drugs. The kind that destroyed communities and ruined lives. Sarah picked up her satellite phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in over a year. Ghost line. A voice answered on the second ring. "This is Phoenix," Sarah said, using her old call sign. "I need information on suspected drug activity at Pier 17. Coordinates 41.7 north, 81.5 west." There was a long pause. "Phoenix, this line is supposed to be dead. Sometimes the dead have things to say." Another pause. Then, the sound of typing. "Pier 17 is under DEA surveillance. They've been watching suspected cartel activity for 6 months, but can't get close enough for actionable intelligence." "What kind of cartel?" "Los Hermanos Negros. Black brothers. They specialize in synthetic drugs, particularly fentanyl. Extremely violent. Extremely connected. They have people in local law enforcement." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. Fentanyl was killing teenagers across the country, including in small towns like this one. She had seen the obituaries in the local newspaper. Young faces smiling from graduation photos, their lives cut short by drugs that had been designed to addict and kill. Timeline on the DEA operation? Months, possibly years. They're building a case, trying to get the bigger fish. How many people die while they build their case? "Phoenix, this isn't your fight anymore. You're supposed to be..." Sarah ended the call. She sat in the darkness of her apartment, looking out at the quiet street below. An elderly man walked his dog past the hardware store. A young mother pushed a stroller toward the park. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that tomorrow night, poison would flow through their community like water through a broken dam. In her old life, Elena Rodriguez would have called for backup, assembled a team, followed protocol. But Elena Rodriguez was dead, and Sarah Martinez was just a useless waitress that nobody noticed. Sometimes being invisible was the greatest advantage of all. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Murphy's Diner early for her shift. She had spent the night planning, and now she needed to prepare. Brad wasn't in yet, which gave her time to do what needed to be done. She went to the storage room in the back and found what she was looking for: the old industrial freezer that hadn't worked in years. Brad was too cheap to have it hauled away, so it sat in the corner collecting dust. Sarah opened it and began removing the shelves, creating enough space for what she had in mind. "What are you doing?" Brad's voice made her turn around. He had arrived early, probably hoping to catch her doing something wrong so he could write her up. "Cleaning," Sarah said simply. "You said the storage room was a mess." Brad looked suspicious, but he couldn't argue with her explanation. "Well, don't take all day. Tables need to be set up front." As Sarah worked through her shift, she noticed things she had never paid attention to before. The layout of the diner, the location of the emergency exits, the sightlines from the street. By the time her shift ended at 11, she had a complete tactical assessment of the building stored in her memory. "Another thrilling day of watching you accomplish nothing," Brad said as she hung up her apron. "I swear, sometimes I think you're not even really here." Sarah almost smiled at that. If only he knew how right he was. "See you tomorrow," she said, heading for the door. Maybe, Brad called after her. I'm thinking about making some changes around here. Sarah paused at the door. What kind of changes? The kind where useless employees find new jobs. This time, Sarah did smile, though she kept her back to Brad so he couldn't see it. We'll see about that. Note: as she drove home, Sarah's mind was already working through the details of what would happen in less than 12 hours. The cartel thought they were bringing their poison into a defenseless community. They thought the local law enforcement was in their pocket. They thought no one was watching who could stop them. They were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you never notice. Back in her apartment, Sarah opened the metal box again and began removing items she hadn't touched in 2 years. Black tactical clothing, night vision goggles, a ceramic knife that wouldn't show up on metal detectors, and finally, a small device that looked like an ordinary smartphone, but was actually a military-grade communications jamming device. Tomorrow night, the Black brothers would discover that their easy score had turned into their worst nightmare, and Brad would learn that the woman he called useless had skills he couldn't even imagine. But first, Sarah had one more call to make. She picked up her satellite phone and dialed another number. Emergency services, how can I help you? I'd like to report a gas leak at Murphy's Diner on Oak Street, Sarah said, disguising her voice with a slight accent. I think I smell gas coming from the building. We'll send someone to investigate immediately. Thank you. Sarah ended the call and looked out her window at the diner across the street. By tomorrow night, the building would be empty and officially off-limits due to the gas leak investigation. It would make the perfect staging area for what she had planned. The quiet waitress that everyone ignored was about to remind some very dangerous people why you should never underestimate someone who has been trained to kill. The gas company truck pulled away from Murphy's Diner at 6 in the evening, leaving behind yellow caution tape and official notices declaring the building unsafe for entry. Sarah watched from her apartment window as the last technician loaded his equipment and drove off. The fictional gas leak had worked perfectly. She had spent the day acting like any other Tuesday, serving customers and enduring Brad's insults. He had been particularly nasty today, apparently having decided that tonight would be her last shift. He kept making comments about cleaning house and getting rid of dead weight. You know what your problem is, Sarah? He had said during the dinner rush, loud enough for customers to hear. You're like a ghost. People look right through you. No wonder you can't even get a decent tip. A family at table 6 had looked embarrassed for her. The mother had left an extra $5, whispering, "Don't mind him, honey." As they left, Sarah had smiled and thanked her, playing her role perfectly. Now, as darkness fell over the small town, Sarah prepared for a very different kind of performance. She changed into black tactical clothing she hadn't worn in 2 years. The fabric felt familiar against her skin, like putting on an old uniform. She strapped the ceramic knife to her thigh and clipped the communication jammer to her belt. The night vision goggles went into a small backpack, along with zip tie restraints and a first aid kit. Looking in the mirror, Sarah barely recognized herself. Gone was the tired waitress, with the slouched shoulders and downcast eyes. In her place stood someone who moved with lethal grace. Someone whose presence filled the room, even when she was perfectly still. At 11:30, she made her way down to the alley behind her building. The streets were quiet, with only the occasional car passing through downtown. She had studied the patrol routes of the local police and knew she had a 20-minute window before the next scheduled drive-by. The rear entrance to Murphy's Diner was secured with police tape, but the lock was the same cheap deadbolt Brad had refused to upgrade despite 3 break-ins over the past year. Sarah had the door open in less than 30 seconds. Inside, the diner felt different in the darkness. Without the harsh fluorescent lights and constant noise, it was just an empty shell, filled with shadows. Sarah moved through it like she owned the place, which in a way, she did. She knew every squeak in the floorboards, every blind spot, every angle of approach. She made her way to the storage room and opened the old freezer she had prepared that morning. It was the perfect hiding spot. Invisible from the dining area, but with a clear view of the back entrance through a crack in the doorframe. At midnight, she activated the communication jammer. Any cell phones or radios within 100 yards would now show no signal. It was an old SEAL technique for isolating targets and preventing them from calling for backup. 20 minutes later, she heard the first vehicle approaching. A black SUV pulled into the alley behind the diner, its headlights sweeping across the building before going dark. Sarah watched through her night vision goggles as 4 men got out. She recognized 2 of them from the diner, the tall, thin man with slicked-back hair and his scarred partner. The other 2 were new, but their movements marked them as professionals. They carried themselves like soldiers, but their gear and attitudes suggested they had chosen the wrong side of the law. "Quiet night," the tall man said as they approached the back door. "Perfect for business. Boss wants this done clean," replied the scarred man. "In and out. No complications." "What complications could there be?" laughed one of the new men, a heavy-set guy with tattoos covering his arms. "It's a dead-end town full of sheep. They had a key to the back door, which meant they had someone on the inside." Sarah made a mental note to find out who later. The 4 men entered the diner and began setting up in the dining area, spreading equipment on the tables. "Shipment should be here in 30 minutes, the tall man said, checking his watch. "We process it here, bag it, and have it distributed by morning. By the time anyone realizes what happened, we'll be 3 states away." Sarah watched as they unpacked scales, cutting agents, and packaging materials. This wasn't just a transfer point. They were planning to cut the pure product and multiply its street value. $2 million worth of fentanyl could become $10 million worth after they diluted it and packaged it for street sales. "How much product are we talking about?" asked the tattooed man. "Enough to supply the entire region for 6 months, the scarred man replied. "Pure stuff from the labs in Mexico. Kill rate is about 60% higher than street fentanyl, meaning it'll hook kids faster and kill them quicker. Boss likes customers who can't complain about the product quality." All 4 men laughed at that, and Sarah felt her jaw tighten. These weren't just criminals. They were predators who took pleasure in destroying lives. In her military career, she had eliminated enemy combatants who were more honorable than these men. At 12:45, headlights appeared in the alley again. This time, it was a white panel van, with no markings. 2 more men got out, both armed with assault rifles. They were security for the shipment. Professional muscle hired to make sure nothing went wrong. The driver of the van was a woman in her 30s, with short blonde hair and cold eyes. She wore expensive clothes and carried herself like someone used to giving orders. This had to be higher up in the organization, maybe even the boss the others had mentioned. "Gentlemen," she said as she entered the diner, "I hope you're ready to work. We have a schedule to keep." "Everything's set up," the tall man assured her. "Just need the product." The woman nodded to her security team, and they began unloading metal briefcases from the van. Sarah counted 12 cases total, each one probably containing several kilograms of pure fentanyl. The street value was staggering. But more importantly, this much product would flood the local market and kill dozens of young people within weeks. "Beautiful work," the woman said as the first case was opened, revealing packages of white powder sealed in plastic. This batch tested at 97% purity. "A few grains of this could kill an elephant." "Grains? How do you want it cut?" asked the scarred man. "Standard ratio. 1 part product to 20 parts filler. That should give us enough volume to supply our entire network while maintaining potency." Sarah did the math in her head. They would turn 12 briefcases into enough product to fill several trucks. The distribution network was bigger than she had initially thought. She waited until they were all focused on their work before making her move. The first target was the security guard posted near the back door. Sarah emerged from the storage room like a shadow, her ceramic knife sliding between his ribs before he even knew she was there. He dropped silently, and she dragged his body behind the counter. The second guard was harder. He was positioned near the front windows, where he could watch the street. But that also meant He was isolated from the group. Sarah approached from his blind spot, using tables and chairs for cover. When she was close enough, she wrapped her arm around his throat and applied pressure to his carotid artery. He was unconscious in seconds and would stay that way for at least an hour. Now there were 5 people left, the 4 men from earlier and the blonde woman who was clearly in charge. Sarah moved to the kitchen area and began her psychological warfare campaign. She turned on the industrial dishwasher, which made a loud rumbling sound that echoed through the building. When the tattooed man came to investigate, she was waiting behind the swinging doors. "What the hell?" he muttered, looking around the empty kitchen. "Must be some kind of automatic timer." He turned off the dishwasher. But as soon as he started to leave, Sarah turned it back on remotely, using the timer function. This time, she also turned on the deep fryer and the coffee machines. The kitchen filled with noise and steam. "Guys," the tattooed man called out, "we might have a problem back here." Go. What kind of problem?" the tall man responded. "Equipment keeps turning on by itself. Place might be haunted or something." They all laughed, but Sarah could hear the nervousness in their voices. Criminals were often superstitious, and unexplained phenomena made them jumpy. She decided to escalate. Using her knowledge of the building's electrical system, Sarah began turning lights on and off in sequence. First, the kitchen lights, then the dining room, then the bathroom. She created a pattern that seemed almost alive, like something was moving through the building just out of sight. "Okay, that's definitely not normal," the scarred man said. "Maybe we should find another location." "Relax," the blonde woman snapped. "It's an old building with bad wiring. We're not changing the plan because of some electrical problems." But Sarah could see they were all on edge now. They kept looking over their shoulders and jumping at small sounds. Fear was a weapon, and she was an expert at using it. Time for the next phase. Sarah made her way to the basement through a service entrance she had discovered during her months working at the diner. The electrical panel was down there, along with the main water line and the building's ancient heating system. She shut off the electricity to everything except the kitchen equipment, plunging most of the building into darkness. Then, she turned the heat up to maximum and opened all the hot water taps. Within minutes, the building would become uncomfortably hot and humid. Upstairs, she could hear the criminals arguing. "This is getting ridiculous," the tattooed man said. "First, the equipment, now the lights. Something's not right here. It's just old building problems," the tall man insisted, but he sounded less confident than before. "Maybe we should call backup," suggested the scarred man. "Can't," replied the blonde woman. "Radio's dead. Cell phones too. Must be some kind of interference." That was Sarah's communication jammer at work. They were now completely isolated, cut off from any outside help. Classic SEAL tactics. Divide, isolate, and eliminate. She climbed back upstairs and positioned herself in the dining area, using the darkness and her night vision goggles to move unseen among the confused criminals. They had found flashlights, but the beams only created more shadows for her to hide in. "There!" the tall man shouted suddenly, pointing his flashlight toward the corner where Sarah had been standing a moment earlier. "I saw something move." "War! Where?" demanded the blonde woman, pulling out a pistol. "Over by the window. Like a person, but I don't know. It just vanished." Sarah was already behind them, having used their distraction to change positions. She picked up a coffee cup from the counter and threw it across the room, where it shattered against the far wall. All 5 flashlight beams swung toward the sound, but found nothing. "That's it," the scarred man said, backing toward the door. "I'm out of here. This place is cursed or something. Nobody's leaving," the woman ordered. "Finish it yourself," the tattooed man replied. "I've seen enough horror movies to know how this ends." But as he turned toward the exit, Sarah was waiting. The ceramic knife flashed in the darkness, and he collapsed with a surprised grunt. She dragged him behind the counter to join the security guards. "Tommy?" the tall man called out. "Tommy, where did you go?" Silence. Okay, the blonde woman said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. New plan. We load the product back in the van and find a new location. Good idea, the scarred man agreed. This place gives me the creeps. They began frantically repacking the briefcases. Their movements hurried and sloppy. Fear was making them careless. Exactly what Sarah wanted. She waited until they had loaded most of the cases before making her next move. As the tall man carried a briefcase toward the door, she stepped out of the shadows directly in front of him. In the beam of his flashlight, she looked like something from a nightmare. Her black clothing seemed to absorb the light, and her night vision goggles glowed like the eyes of a predator. She stood perfectly still, saying nothing, just watching him with inhuman patience. The tall man screamed and dropped the briefcase, stumbling backward into the scarred man. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs and scattered product. What is it? The woman shouted, swinging her gun toward Sarah's last known position. But Sarah was already moving, flowing through the darkness like water. She had spent years learning to become one with shadows. And now, those skills served her well. The scarred man scrambled to his feet, pulled out his own weapon, and fired blindly into the darkness. The muzzle flashes strobed through the diner, creating a chaotic light show that only made the shadows deeper. "Stop shooting," the woman yelled. "You'll hit one of us." But it was too late for rational thought. Panic had taken over, and they were shooting at ghosts. Sarah used the noise to cover her movement, positioning herself for the final confrontation. When the shooting stopped and they tried to regroup, they discovered they were down to 3 people. The tall man had vanished during the chaos, leaving only the scarred man and the blonde woman. "This is impossible," the woman whispered. "People don't just disappear. Maybe it's the cops," the scarred man suggested. "Some kind of tactical team. Then where are the sirens? Where are the demands to surrender?" Sarah answered that question by stepping into the beam of their flashlights one more time. But now she wasn't alone. Draped over her shoulders like a grotesque shawl was the unconscious form of the tall man. She had taken him down silently during the gunfight and now displayed him like a trophy. "Dear God," the woman breathed. "What are you?" Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm and cold in the darkness. "I'm someone you should have left alone." The psychological warfare was complete. 2 professional criminals who had probably killed dozens of people were now paralyzed with terror. Facing an enemy they couldn't understand or fight, it was time for the final lesson. The blonde woman's hand shook as she pointed her gun at Sarah, who stood motionless in the flickering flashlight beam. The unconscious form of the tall man was still draped across Sarah's shoulders like he weighed nothing at all. "Stay back," the woman shouted. "I'll shoot." "No, you won't," Sarah replied calmly, taking a step forward. "Because then, you'll never find out how I knew about your operation." The woman's finger hesitated on the trigger. "What are you talking about?" Sarah gently lowered the tall man to the floor and stood up slowly, keeping her hands visible. In the darkness, she looked like a specter of death, but her voice remained conversational. "Your security was compromised from the beginning," she said. "Someone told me exactly when and where you'd be here. Someone who knew your entire plan." "That's impossible," the scarred man said, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. "Nobody knew, except who?" Sarah interrupted. "Your boss? Your contacts in law enforcement? Your inside man at the diner? Aksa, you are boss. You are boss." The woman's eyes widened. "Inside man?" Sarah smiled, though they couldn't see it in the darkness. "You really thought Brad gave you the key, out of the goodness of his heart? That he just happened to suggest this place as a meeting spot? He's been working with the DEA for months, feeding them information about your organization." This was a complete lie, but Sarah had learned long ago that the truth was less important than what people were willing to believe. Criminals lived in a world of paranoia and betrayal, where anyone could be an enemy. "Brad's working for the feds?" the scarred man asked, looking confused. "Think about it. Sarah continued, moving slightly to her left. How else would they know to have someone in place? How else would I know exactly when you'd be here? The woman lowered her gun slightly, her mind racing through the implications. But you're just a waitress. Am I? Sarah asked. Or am I exactly what I appear to be? A federal agent deep undercover. Waiting for you to walk into our trap. She gestured around the darkened diner. Did you really think the power failures were coincidental? The radio jamming? The systematic elimination of your security team? This is a textbook federal takedown, and you walked right into it. The psychological manipulation was working perfectly. Both criminals were now looking at each other with suspicion, wondering who else might be working against them. If you're a federal agent, the woman said slowly. Where's your backup? Who says they're not already here? Sarah replied. How do you think your men disappeared so quietly? You think one person could take down trained security? As if on cue, Sarah activated a small device on her belt that created the sound of radio static, followed by a realistic-sounding voice. Alpha team in position. Bravo team covering rear exit. Target building surrounded. It was actually a recorded message she had prepared earlier, played through a small speaker. But in the darkness and chaos, it sounded completely authentic. The scarred man dropped his weapon and raised his hands. I surrender. Don't shoot. Shut up, you idiot, the woman hissed. It's a trick. But the damage was done. The scarred man was already backing toward the door, hands in the air. I'm not going down for this. I want to make a deal. Sarah decided to press her advantage. Smart man. First one to cooperate gets the best deal. Your boss is already in custody. By the way, picked him up an hour ago, when he tried to leave the country. This was another lie. But it had the desired effect. The woman's face went pale in the flashlight beam. Carlos is arrested, she whispered. Carlos Mendoza, age 47, originally from Guadalajara, Sarah recited, making up details that sounded official. Currently being held without bail on federal drug trafficking charges. He's already started talking about his organization. The woman's gun hand dropped to her side. The fight went out of her, as she realized she was alone, abandoned by her boss, and surrounded by enemies. What do you want? She asked quietly. Information, Sarah replied. Names, locations, distribution networks, everything you know about Los Hermanos Negros. And if I cooperate? Witness protection, new identity, chance to start over somewhere your former associates will never find you. It was a compelling offer, especially for someone who believed she had no other options. The woman holstered her weapon and sat down heavily in one of the diner chairs. There's a warehouse on the east side of town, she began. Industrial District, building number 47. That's where we store the processed product before distribution. Sarah listened carefully, memorizing every detail. The woman talked for 20 minutes, revealing locations, names, and operational procedures. It was a complete intelligence download that would cripple the cartel's operations in 3 states. When she was finished, Sarah zip-tied both criminals and left them sitting back-to-back in the center of the diner. She gathered all the briefcases containing the fentanyl and loaded them into their van. What happens to us now? The woman asked. Local police will find you in about an hour, Sarah replied, along with enough evidence to put you away for a very long time. But you said witness protection. I lied. Sarah's voice had changed, becoming harder and more dangerous. Did you really think I was going to let drug dealers walk free? People who laugh about killing children? The woman's face went white as she realized she had been played. You're not a federal agent. No, I'm not. Then who are you? Sarah removed her night vision goggles and looked directly at the woman. In the dim light, her eyes were cold and merciless. I'm someone whose community you tried to poison. Someone you made the mistake of underestimating. She turned and walked toward the door, then paused. Oh, and that story about Brad working with the DEA? Also a lie. He's just a petty tyrant who thinks he's important. though after tonight, he might want to reconsider his career choices. Outside, Sarah loaded the van with the fentanyl and drove it to an abandoned quarry 10 miles out of town. She had already prepared a thermite charge that would burn hot enough to destroy the drugs completely. As the white powder turned to ash and smoke, she calculated that she had just prevented hundreds of overdose deaths. She returned to town just as the sun was rising, parking the empty van in the police station parking lot with a note explaining what the authorities would find at Murphy's diner. She included all the intelligence the woman had provided, along with detailed instructions on how to roll up the rest of the cartel's network. By 7 o'clock, she was back in her apartment, watching from her window as police cars surrounded the diner. The two criminals were led away in handcuffs, along with their unconscious associates, who were just beginning to wake up. At 8 o'clock, Sarah put on her waitress uniform and walked across the street to Murphy's diner. The police had finished processing the scene and were allowing Brad to survey the damage. "What happened here?" Sarah asked innocently, approaching the yellow tape. "Break-in," one of the officers explained. "Looks like some kind of drug operation gone wrong." Found several suspects tied up inside, along with evidence of a major trafficking ring. Brad stood in the doorway, looking stunned. "I don't understand," he kept saying. "Why would they choose my place?" "Sometimes criminals pick random locations," the officer said. "Wrong place, wrong time." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "That's terrible. I hope they catch whoever was responsible." "Oh, we got them," the officer assured her. "Caught them red-handed. This case is going to make headlines." As the police finished their work and began to leave, Brad turned to Sarah with a strange expression on his face. "You know what's weird?" he said. "I had a dream about you last night. In the dream, you weren't just a waitress. You were something else. Something dangerous." Sarah looked at him with the same mild expression she had worn every day for 6 months. "That's an interesting dream, Brad. What do you think it means?" "1. I don't know," he replied, shaking his head. "But when I woke up, I realized something. I've been treating you badly, and I don't even know why. You're a good employee, reliable, hard-working." "Thank you," Sarah said simply. "I mean it. You deserve better than the way I've been acting." Brad looked genuinely embarrassed. "I was thinking about giving you a raise. Maybe promoting you to shift supervisor." "That's very kind of you." Brad nodded and walked back to the diner to continue assessing the damage. He would never know how close he had come to being investigated as an accomplice in a major drug operation. Sarah's lies about him working with the cartel had been convincing enough to plant doubt in the criminals' minds. But she had made sure the evidence wouldn't support those claims. 3 weeks later, Sarah read in the newspaper that the entire Los Hermanos Negros network had been dismantled. The intelligence she had obtained had led to arrests in 5 states and the seizure of enough drugs to supply a small country. The cartel's operations were finished. The article mentioned that the breakthrough had come from an anonymous tip that led police to a major drug operation at a local diner. No mention was made of how the criminals had been subdued or who had provided the detailed intelligence that broke the case wide open. Sarah folded the newspaper and looked across the street at Murphy's diner, where she could see Brad through the window, probably practicing his new management style on some other employee. He had been treating everyone better since the incident, as if the shock had knocked some sense into him. Her satellite phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Phoenix," she answered. "This is Ghostline. We've been monitoring the situation with Los Hermanos Negros. Impressive work. I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course not. But if someone were hypothetically responsible for that operation, they would want to know that certain people in high places are very grateful. Hypothetically. And if that same someone were interested in returning to active duty, certain problems from their past might disappear." Sarah looked out at the quiet street, where normal people were going about their normal lives, safe from dangers they would never know existed. "Thanks for the offer," she said. "But I think I'm exactly where I need to be. Understood. But the offer stands, if you change your mind. I'll keep that in mind. Sarah ended the call and deleted the number from her phone. Elena Rodriguez was still officially dead, and Sarah Martinez intended to keep it that way. She had found something in this small town that she had never expected to find. Peace. Not the peace of retirement, but the peace of knowing she was exactly where she belonged. Protecting people who didn't even know they needed protection. Being the guardian angel that no one saw coming. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Murphy's diner for her shift. Brad greeted her with a smile and a fresh cup of coffee. "Good morning, Sarah. Ready for another day?" "Always," she replied, tying on her apron. As the breakfast crowd began to arrive, Sarah moved through the diner with the same quiet efficiency she had always shown. To anyone watching, she was just a waitress, doing her job. But now everyone knew better than to underestimate the quiet ones, because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you never notice. And sometimes the woman they call useless is the only thing standing between innocent people and those who would do them harm. Sarah Martinez smiled as she refilled coffee cups and took orders, secure in the knowledge that her small town was safe, and if another threat ever emerged, they would learn the same lesson that Los Hermanos Negros had learned. Never underestimate a SEAL.